Um, so yeah, to kick things off, our first question is going to be for Vanya. So for startups that are struggling to develop a cost-effective strategy, what areas would you first investigate to build a better data solution?
Thanks, Hezekiah. Well, I would say the four things that people should really focus on when you're a startup are: the first is the business model, the second is the team, the third is collecting the right data, and finally, the technology. I would say to focus on the a robust business model and align your data strategy towards that is possibly the most important thing you can do. You're going to hear a lot of buzzwords, and you might go somewhere and talk to someone and say that you want to put that in your plan. But the thing is, if you stay focused, you're probably going to get to a better solution than if you don't. Remember, data is only a resource that enables you to get to a solution, but it's not the solution by itself. So if you're trying to retrofit your business case to the data that you have, you're probably not going to get very far. It's better to know what you're doing first. The second thing is always make sure you have some way of measuring success, because it's important to have these kind of measurable goalposts throughout your entire strategy. So the second thing that we should be talking about is the team. Having every person that you need in place is extremely important. Basically, what you would need is someone on the analysis side and someone on the engineering side. So if you don't have one of them, there are always other ways to make sure that you can fill the holes in your team, but your team would end up being the most important thing to focus on in a startup. The third thing would be to collect the right data. There's a lot of data out there, but more is not always better. So you got to be very careful about how much data you get and what are the sources for this data. Now, as a startup, you may not know what the metrics should be, etc. A good place to start would be to go and look at competitors, see what, or people, if you're looking into a new industry, go and see what they're using. And there's a lot of data out there with visualizations. These things could be very helpful. And once you have all of this in place, then you can choose the technology that you quite cheaply. There's no barrier to entry now with the cloud and with open software. These are all cost-effective ways for you to be able to get started, build up an entire data center or tear it down within a day. So I would say if you focus on these four things, you have a lot of cost-effective ways of going forward.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Vanya. I think that was a really awesome answer. And as we're talking about these big pictures that you're talking about, maybe Gabby, you can provide some insight on, what exactly does a startup company need, maybe from the sales side of things, to create this effective data strategy. If we're talking about a certain number of hires, or we're talking about a certain number of customers, what should startups be looking at? Maybe building upon the points that Vanya just mentioned.
Yeah, and based on what Vanya was saying, when you're trying to build a data strategy, just like any strategy, it's a dream if you don't have an action plan on how you're going to execute, right? So really thinking of, that strategy, you really need to understand what the end goal for that data strategy, on what type of information you're going to be collecting and what are you going to be using that data for. So a key driver for that, it's people and resources, right? You can have an awesome strategy, but you need the people that are going to execute on that strategy and be the ones who will be driving it, right? And at startup too, you got to look for roles. There are people who are generalists, right? People that can wear many hats. Because you're not going to be able to afford to have a data analytic or a specific roles to fit just only one specific role, right? So that's very important. Now, after you have those key people in your company that wear many hats, right, you need to understand your end goal. So for my experience, right, I'm in sales. What I care about is, how can we sell this product, right? That it's hopefully helping solve challenges for customers. When you get the data, it's important that you think about a CRM, right? I feel that that's a foundation and investment that you should make, because you're going to be able to start collecting data on prospects, on customers, right? And at a startup level, let's say you have your first customer, right? So then now your goal is to have more customers, but then really using the data you collected of, in order for me to get that customer, I needed, let's say, 4 trials. And, in order for me to get 4 trials, I needed to book 8 demos. And then to get 8 demos, I needed to make, 400 calls. And then, so really understanding all of that data will enable you to set goals for the people in your company and say, okay, our goal is to have this amount of customers. So that means that in this specific role, sales marketing, you will need to make this amount of, calls or demos or trials, etc. So yeah, so hopefully that kind of gives some insight into the sales side of the business.
Yeah, I think you definitely provided some incredible insights from the sales side of things, and you talked a lot about data and how data and sales comes together when we're thinking about building these cost-effective data strategies. And we have someone on the call who wears that hat of being the data scientist at their startup. So maybe Bulent, you could talk a little bit about some of the main costs that may be associated with a data budget. For a startup that's looking at data science and maybe how they would maximize that ROI.
Sure. I'll be happy to expand on what Vanya and Gabby just said. They come from a very strong commercial and tech perspective. And certainly when we look at startups, there is a considerable number of startups, particularly here in the Boston area, that are driven by the R&D arm of the startup. And in the biotech world, in the healthcare world, the talent that you're hiring looks very different from those commercially driven companies. And as Vanya and Gabby said, if you are in a startup or even a larger company that is executing on use cases that come from the marketing or sales, you want to have generalist data science teams that can learn quickly, partner with the domain experts, and then execute on the ground. And there are fantastic tools that would that they can use to build those models and execute with very limited requirement to code. But there's a flip side of the coin where deep R&D driven use cases do exist, and in those cases the talent that you go after looks actually very different. They are very focused on either, let's say, protein folding or drug repurposing, and then the profile looks very different. But then you have a leader that can orchestrate things and align things with different stakeholders. So there was a recent study that I shared with Luv, and hopefully after this presentation he can share the document, which the embargo was lifted September 15. It's one of a kind benchmarking study which was conducted with 1,200 companies across the globe. They looked at metrics, success metrics when it comes to ROI with AI, and where they fail and where they succeed. I think those people who talk about their own perspectives, including myself, we have been limited to our own biased perspectives. But now we have a high-level study which gives us a bird's eye view of the industry. Through that lens, we can actually identify what areas to invest into, how to formalize and customize our data strategy. And nowadays, certainly the data science operations has kind of a large portion of the data science budget or data budget in general. So I think focusing on the talent is primary, and then secondary, certainly the technology has to be in place, and you might have generalists in the team, but also people that are focused onto specific use cases and that aligns well with the business vision of that company is, I think, essential. So customize your data strategy rather than coming up with kind of a black box data strategy that you can apply to every company. It's essential to look at your resources, your goals, what you're trying to achieve with what budget.
Yeah, I think that's totally awesome. And I want to stay on this same topic about customizing strategy. And I think, in today's day, we're seeing a lot of places try to go toward this idea of making something custom and, customizing for, the budget of small businesses or startups. And I'm wondering, Hassan, if maybe you can talk a little bit about the role of AI. You know, that's a really huge buzzword today when we think about artificial intelligence, and maybe how should startups be leveraging AI in the form of chatbots, in the form of fraud detection, and really just driving business in a way that reduces costs and manual labor.
Yeah, thanks, Ezekiel, for this great question. So I'll break down the interaction with startups and AI in roughly two places. There's a kind of startups that they have a given product, and it works, and they need to now gather data about understanding, interaction with customers, that kind of analytics. So AI plays a role of business analytics there. And you have the second kind, that where the model are actually very important for the product. So if the models don't work, the product doesn't work. And so this means that it can become a technical risk, in addition to the market risk, which is, will people buy the product assuming it works? But here, when you're dealing with probabilistic model, they always have a failure edge case. And so the one of the first lever, if one is on the second side, is identifying initial relatively less risky low-hanging fruits, or initial MVPs that would basically not incur spending enormous of time to develop the solution, to also mitigate both the technical and market risk. So that's like one first lever that can be used in a way to initially reduce cost to get the signal as far as whether the customers would be interested in those model-based products. And speaking from experience at Entropy, we had to do a mix of deep learning models as well as originally sampler models, just to get a sense of and one of the way we prioritize is we prioritize using a mix of the characteristics that customers wanted, which were high priorities, and we cross-combine that with the technical difficulty of executing against what all customers want. And for reference, we build NLP model for customer support, so for QA managers of customer support. So there are a lot of features that can be built there. So we first thought about how to mitigate both the market and execution risk, such that for the initial customers that we had in pilot, we're able to convert them, and then when that happens, there is a virtuous cycle in which the data actually helps to get the models to become better and things like that. So I think it's like from personal experience, the first part is analyzing the combination of market and technical risk, and managing that by ideally prioritizing and understanding use case for which the models in their initial state could lead to a viable product, and then also simultaneously managing the market risk by understanding whether, assuming whether the product works, the customers would want, and then further investing into these.
Yeah, I think that's really awesome. And you touched on a lot of the technicality behind strategy, and how you can use data science and specifically AI to really get customer feedback and use it in a way that's driving the strategy for your startup. I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about the role of data culture and hygiene within that, and how are you as a lead data scientist approaching that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is a great point. And over time, I got to think about the source of data that would power our product. And right now there is roughly 3 buckets. The first one is the data source, which is used to build better models. So that is usually labeled data of the kind of example that one would want, and that is used to train the model. They can be both proprietary data and publicly available data. The second one is what I would say more behavioral. What features are used, not used, how people do interact with the product. And then the third one is actually how are the models faring in production over time. And so that's actually important to keep track, because models are powered by assumptions. And if the assumptions over time that power your model change, one needs to be able to keep track of those. So one example was that, we said that COVID really changed a lot of models' assumptions, because there was a pre-COVID way of behaviors that was powering a lot of models, and now there's a post-COVID way. And so it's very important to actually have internally models and ways to keep track of how your predictive outputs are behaving over time. And so require understanding and managing this complexity as the organization and customer base grow is, are like key ingredient for, what we'd call a data culture, because you really think about these three buckets and creating process to understand how to interact with these three buckets, which is, what are the sources that can improve my models? How are users interacting with the product such that this informs the prioritization of features and workflows? And then the third one, which is how are my models doing in production over time? And keeping track of, in our case, keeping track of the reviewed data and then the overwritten data. Because, if we understand that our models are not perfect, we give the human the flexibility to actually override, but we also keep track of those override, and that is part of the what you would say the data strategy. And it's important for to make this information easily available to stakeholders across the organization, both technical and non-technical. Yeah. And it ends up being a lot of information to manage very quickly, and that's where understanding where this information comes from and how it affects the decision is key for what you would call a data culture. And I hope this helps.
Very, very awesome. And I'm wondering, Gabby, as we're talking about, the various sources that we can acquire data in the various forms that data can come in ways that startups should be thinking about how they are leveraging these different sources. Do you think there's a benefit maybe on the sales side of finding a way to centralize all of these different repositories, and maybe what the impacts that would be on pushing this idea of creating a cost-effective data strategy?
Yeah, I believe it's, like I mentioned before, it's so important to have a CRM, right? To be able to be the foundation where you're going to be collecting the data, tracking it, and being able to have one place that you can be able to centralize all this information, right? So then you have one place where you keep all this data and be able within that data build reports, build dashboards for the employees to be able to track that. I know Bulent could talk about, maybe some different types of CRMs that people can think about.
Sure, I can. Should I jump in?
Yeah.
Okay. I didn't want to cut you off.
No,
yeah, I had some experience where larger companies, they were investing quite a bit into Salesforce type of platforms. Also, Marketo and Polaris are two other platforms where you can gather different types of information and then put them together. One limitation, though, I would say combining multiple platforms is a pain. So for startups, making that decision from the get-go, since they're just a startup going into data collecting, making a single decision and then aggregating the data in that platform, I think is a well worth investment at the very beginning. Many startups, actually, they are working with cloud nowadays, where they pull and aggregate their data. It's also, in the short term, it's cost effective. In the long term, depending on the domain they're in, whether they are regulated or not, they might consider investing into their internal infrastructure. But as a startup, working with third-party companies that can do that for them, rather than hiring a whole IT team, I think is a strategy that I see on the ground with startups that definitely makes a lot of sense. So working with AWS or Google Cloud or some other cloud providers, Azure, alongside with third-party companies that can work with you to put together your greatest asset, which is data, I think is essentially very, very important.
Very, very awesome. And I'm wondering, Vanya, as our CTO on the call, can you maybe talk about how startups should be prioritizing, these different technologies that we're talking about, these different really almost like mindsets that they're bringing to their strategy, and how does that really work to allow them to get that bang for their buck?
Absolutely. As I said, the first thing that they should prioritize is the business model. They have to clearly figure out what they're going to do. But I strongly encourage them to put this down in paper. You really have to have a business plan. You have to have your metrics set, because a lot of times you have a number of different people working on it. And unless you're all on the same page, it's difficult to get something out. So I would say definitely have a business plan, have even a data strategy plan, so that everybody knows what it is that they're choosing as a metric. Choosing a metric is another difficult thing, because everybody may have a different idea. So you could say my metric is this, the number of new signups. But if you're only looking at that as a metric, and you're not looking at maybe the cost of acquisition or customer engagement, you might be missing the whole point of it. So when you're a startup, it's a little difficult to choose a metric. When we were at AdRocks is a geolocation-based advertising platform. So when we were at AdRocks, we did not have advertising expertise, because that's our final customer. So what we did is we actually went backwards. We came up with a wireframe which said, after talking to our customers and actually looking at other people's websites too, because it's kind of hard to understand when you're walking into a new industry, what is it people want to see? So what we did is we went and talked to people, looked at other websites, said, oh, people seem to say that if, to prove that this is a effective advertising platform, they want to know how many people saw this ad, where they saw this ad, at what time they saw this ad, and whether there was any action done after they saw this ad. So we put that information together in a wireframe, and then started going backwards to see where we could get data to give our customers what they want. So instead of looking at data just the way it is and then diving into it and trying to see what the solution is, it's much better sometimes to figure out the problem, figure out what the solution to that problem is, and go and hunt for the data and see if you can find it. So I would say that would be one of the most important things. The second thing, as everyone has said, is it's your team. I would say if you're going to prioritize anything, 90% of your cost should be in choosing the right people and making sure you have no holes in your team. Because the rest of it will work out as long as you have all the right people. And I know in some cases, as Bhuvan had said, that if it's, say, in biomedical, et cetera, there's expertise that you absolutely need. But if it's, say, an internet startup and you just need someone with analytical skills, someone with engineering skills, etc. And you might have all those people if you bring them into a room and ask the right questions. And if you don't, you could always outsource it, which is what we did. So we had a great analytics person on board, but we really did not, because of the time crunch, etc., we did not have the time or the skill sets to go and build it out. So we outsourced it. But if you're going to do that, there are also trade-offs. You have to have someone on your team who's sort of well-versed with dealing with teams that are all over the place. So, you have to keep all these things. You have to look at your team and see what you have and what you need and work with that. And I would say the third thing is don't take on too much. You know, when you start off, you're aiming for the skies. You think you can build just about everything. And this sort of actually makes you lose your focus on what it is that you're building. So I would say make sure that you know what your one or two first deliverables have to be, and break it up into small projects that are sort of manageable and doable, and get them out there. Get something out to your customers so that you can get some feedback and some data and go forward. And you know, always keep your long-term goals and your short-term deliverables sort of manageable.
Right. And you know, a follow-up question that I would love to hear from yourself and from Bulan as well is, um, once you're have this team that you're working with, and you're going through the process of creating this data strategy, how do you go about getting folks on board and really focus on the communication? You're saying, okay, I have this data, and I'm aware of the trade-offs that might be associated with the different decisions that I'm making, but how do I make this vision very transparent for my team so that we have everybody on the same page, everybody's on board, and we're still working collectively to create a cost-effective data strategy?
You want me to go answer that?
Whoever wants to go first.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I have found that documenting everything and making sure that everybody understands what the priorities are the most important thing. I have noticed that you can go into a meeting and everyone talks about, oh, this is a great idea, that's a great idea. But when they walk out of the meeting, they're not really sure if they're all on the same page for even a definition of a term. So one person's definition could be, you know, if I saw a like, it means that that's success. And the other person thinks of it as just a small part of it. So I've noticed that whenever you actually document things and be as clear as possible, like you don't want to say that I just want to increase, say something by 10%. You want to say, I want to see to it that we have X number of, at least X number of customers in this time frame for this cost of acquisition, etc. So be as clear as possible. And when you're meeting together, make sure that everybody understands that one person is going to get this data document out there, and everybody is always on the same page when it comes to that. Go ahead.
Yeah, I want to say something to this as well, to what Vanya has said. Definitely having different languages is a barrier. Specifically, I can talk about data science operations where you tap into a talent that come from very diverse backgrounds. The technical language that they speak is very different. And on top of that, the business language that comes from stakeholders really impedes that communication and production. So I think what also was coming out from that benchmarking study is there are two things that are critically important for companies at any level. One of them is what type of leader you're working with, and the company culture. So the what we've seen is in short-term and long-term impact and ROI creation, the fact that many companies are going after leaders that come with very strong business credentials but very limited technical capabilities limits the long-term vision building, and it certainly reflects on the ROI creation. So what we've seen is leaders who can wear two hats, where they can be the strategic pragmatic leader that talks to the stakeholders, brings them on board, educates them, but also can sit down with the team, pull up the sleeves, and even code with them, talk on technical issues at every level is critically important for not only for talent attraction, but also for retention. Turnover is a huge cost for data science operations nowadays. It's a pragmatic aspect of the operations, but unless you have that mentorship, internal learning culture that you're promoting, be a part of that culture, it's very difficult to keep top talent in your operation. So having that multi-level, multifaceted attribute that goes with leadership, mentorship, but also a highly skilled person is critically important.
I'd like to actually piggyback on that. And I've actually been in startups where this point was the case and not the case. And actually, this is very true. I'm actually often very impressed by how much our CEO knows about all of the details of our models, sit down and read paper. I mean, he has an engineering background and then did an MBA, but like more specifically, he really sits and like follow, leaders in the space on Twitter and LinkedIn, and often send us this. And it really does feel different as a team, because we feel like, the support come from all levels. So really wanted to emphasize that point and not have, say these technology become a black box, but really diving as much as possible into the detailed understanding, because that even helps with managing expectation when talking to outside stakeholders, if one knows what can be done well, not well, why. And yeah, this is a very good point.
Well, I would like to add one thing. I agree with both of you, but I think it should be both ways. I think the engineers should also know the business, the practice, what you're aiming for from the business side, because you have a lot of data scientists who are just focused on this and they lose perspective. They come up with things like, oh, we just found out like 30% of the people don't use this, but they like it. It doesn't help you. You have to understand this is the business goal. So it's kind of good for the engineers to also understand the business goals. my two.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a great point. And I also want to go deeper on something that I believe, if I'm hearing these responses correctly, that I think speaks to this idea of strategy is not only operating on a team, but also having a sense of ownership as well, and not only the responsibilities that you're fulfilling in your role, but maybe a sense of ownership that your startup should be having in terms of keeping track with what the overall data strategy that's relevant to your startup. And on that idea, I want to see if someone can speak to the effectiveness of using a proprietary data strategy. And is there a way that we talked a little bit earlier about outsourcing and maybe the cost of using different data sources. Is there a way that startups should be leveraging these different sources in a way that's not financially burdensome?
I can make a quick comment on that. I think there is a wealth of publicly available information out there that brings in a lot of value in not only the predictive aspect of things, but also in the operational sense. And with a leadership that can combine the business mindset and has a really deep understanding of what modeling is, what type of information you're trying to augment, we have done this in the R&D space, but also in the commercial space by tapping into publicly available information to push our predictive power over the limitations that we had to produce something that's unprecedented. So there's a lot of information out there that you can tap into that's completely free.
Totally awesome. Did anybody else have, maybe any input on the idea of a proprietary data strategy? I know Gabby, you're definitely our sales go-to person on the call. Have you, had any experiences with trying to think about ways in which you can reduce that financial burden, even though you're kind of juggling all of these different data sources, and how that relates to your overall strategy?
Yeah, like Len said, there's so many tools out there that you can actually use for free on the sales side. When you're trying to look for new prospects for your customers and try to do research and finding the top, the top prospect for your product. So there's, tools that you can use to find, email addresses. There's tools to help you, understand specific searches that people are doing on specific products. So I think overall, there's just many opportunities. Like I say, the internet, there's a lot of opportunities to find things that are free that you can leverage at that beginning stage?
I mean, if you require a proprietary business strategy, I mean, that has to be fundamental to your business. If you can leverage what's out there, that's the best way to start. But a lot of times that might be exactly what your value proposition is. Like for us, one of the things we were trying to offer people is that you can also, usually you only get impressions when you're putting out an advertisement, which is the opportunity, how many people had the opportunity to see the ad. But we wanted to add image recognition to it, saying that not only can we tell you how many people saw the ad, we can tell you who are these people who saw the ad. But the thing is, you have to make sure this is fundamental to your business plan. And as we found out, that was an expensive detour because advertisers really did not want that at this stage. That's a great thing to happen later, but be sure that this is something that is actually going to get you more revenue or something before you go down that road, because that's an expensive path. So, that would be something I would say keep in mind when you're deciding to go through a proprietary data plan.
I think that's fantastic. And as folks are starting to post their questions, and we want to make sure that we have time to answer the questions that everybody is posting, I'm going to pose one last question before we start, looking at the responses from the audience. But we talked in a lot of different ways about how important it is to have a cost-effective data strategy and the various ways that you can go about doing so, and the multiple perspectives that goes into that. And so for startups that might be trying to incorporate these strategies and these nuggets of wisdom, but might feel like they're hitting a plateau or are experiencing maybe a certain level of failure that they're trying to manage, what advice would you post to them? And this is for anyone.
I'm sorry, you're saying that what advice would you give someone to mitigate failure?
Yes.
Stay focused. Stay focused, but also be quick to change, because a lot of times the vicious cycle is that you have to have some data from users before you can, you have to have some users before you can get more data, before you can have a smarter algorithm, and before you can give them a better product. But if this whole life cycle takes too long, then you're probably going to be, by the time you finish it, you may have already failed. So I would say, certainly try to make this cycle as short as possible. Try to get data in as soon as possible. Try to get your product out to customers as soon as possible. Try to get their feedback as soon as possible. Make this iteration as quickly as possible, if you can in your industry. That would be my advice. That's the easiest way, because unless you build something and put it out there, you really never know whether people want it or not. Like a lot of times it's in your head that you want to build, this marvelous thing, but it may not really be what people want. So I would say talk to your customers first, go backwards, and then build exactly what, within what your goal is, build it. That would be my advice.
Yeah, I think that's awesome.
Can I add something, or are we gonna move to another question?
Yeah, let's look at the questions that we've
Okay.
So we have a question from Rob, and it's one challenge for startups that I envision is creating a data set without a large customer base. What low or no cost resources do you use to fill in the blanks? I think we might have touched on this a little bit, but whoever has a response for Rob, feel free to chime in.
I can give a technical perspective to this. We talk about big data, the buzzword, all the time, and then the second thing that sometimes stakeholders talk about is the size of the data, like megabytes, terabytes, which is completely putting the this whole problem out of focus. What is important is the information content, and that is essentially not measured with megabytes or terabytes. So it's really important what type of information you're looking for, and more often than not, in the commercial space, data is actually very limited. And in those cases, if you have a data science team that is trying to use deep learning or some of the proprietary approaches that assumes that you have a lot of information, will fail. And this is one of the sources of failure. So you have to have really technical capabilities in your arsenal that can deal with small data as well as big data and everything in between. And from technical aspect, one thing that machine learning is not doing so great is measure uncertainty. And there are really well-established technical disciplines within statistics, namely Markov chains or Bayesian, that can be implemented into machine learning, that can give you the landscape of uncertainty. You can parameterize your ignorance, and thereby you can make an informed business decision and manage your risk. So that is, I think, critically important. And how you can augment your data would depend on the use case. But as I said, there are different ways of augmenting the data with publicly available information or simulations, or in the case of limited data where you don't have access to any of those two, you can run a Bayesian network by which you can measure what you don't know.
Awesome. I think that's great. And you touched on a lot of different data science techniques and algorithms that can really come into play when we're thinking about networks and MCMCs and how that all can be leveraged by startups to really make some decisions. And so the next question is a little bit less technical and is focusing more on the soft sides of things. And this question is, what soft skills come to mind when thinking about hiring someone to take ownership on data strategy? For example, potential, attitude, cultural fit, etc.
I can say choose people who are passionate and who actually are problem solvers. I would say that would be what you want, because you don't want just someone who has 10 years experience in one particular software or anything, because things are evolving so much, especially in the open source world. So I would say what you're looking for are just problem solvers, people that you can sit in a room, throw a problem out there and say, come on, let's all get together and get to a solution. You want someone who has general skills in both the analytics part of it and in the engineering part of it, but also who has some kind of knowledge about understanding what the business requirements are. So I would say definitely just go for problem solvers. That's far more important than, number of years in a particular field, especially for a startup. If it's a specialized, some specialized skill set that you need, then that's different. But if you're starting out, that would be my recommendation. And Nabulan, do you have any?
Yeah.
Oh,
I believe that also depends on the culture that you're trying to build, right? So you really need to understand, for your startup, like what's the culture that you want that startup to be like, and then what are those values, right? So then if you know exactly what are those values, then when you're hiring, you really are looking out for those values, right? So problem solver, definitely that's one. So I agree with you. Having somebody that has a great attitude, because things are always most of the time going wrong, right? And you have to change. So being able to have that adaptability, that if something goes wrong, you're just going to get up and then figure out a way. So having those type of attitude is something that you're always looking for. Somebody that is always wanting to learn too, right? Because it's like we are learning from each other, we are learning from failures. So being able to adapt, learn, and then execute, it's something that is very important.
Yeah, soft skills is something that is underemphasized on the technical side as well. When I do personally hiring, certainly there are benchmarks for the technical skill set that we're looking for, but adaptability, creativity is critically important. And if you are investing only on the skill sets, and if you don't invest into the learning and mentorship, those skill sets will become obsolete in 6 months or so. So a continual learning internally, mentorship is critically important. And for data scientists to really be able to engage different stakeholders, they have to develop those soft skills. And there are actually very clear pathways how one can do that during the years of college and thereafter. There are really training programs that can teach you certain soft skills. Not everybody is born with good communication skills. Hardly any of the people that are great communicators are born that way. It takes a lot of effort and training and investing into that skill to develop those skill sets. So, successful data scientists, just from that perspective, are folks that are good on the technical side that can learn really quickly, but also have really good communication and soft skills.
Awesome. And then for the sake of time, we'll take about 2 more questions. So we've gotten a couple questions on metrics, which I think is pretty fitting given the number of high impact leaders that we have on the call. So maybe you all can talk about the role of metrics in creating a cost-effective data strategy, and are there different metrics for different type of products? And someone also asks, is there a universal metric that every startup should be thinking about?
Who wants to? Well, okay. I think metrics are the most important and really the most difficult part of it, because no matter what you build, the most important thing is to understand whether it was successful, and to know if something is successful, you have to have a metric for it. So choosing these metrics are never easy, especially for startups. So I would say that, sometimes it might be as simple as go on to Google Trends if you really don't know and say, what are people talking about in this area? So Google Trends, you can put in a keyword and find out whether this is something that's trending over there, based on a region or anything. So choosing what is important and how to measure it is probably, the definition of success in anything you build. So I would say for startups, definitely spend time, go deep dive into finding out what the right metric is for you. It possibly could be the make or break of your product or your company. So certainly for whatever, as I said, for us, our metrics came from customers, because in the advertising business, it's been around for hundreds of years. So, the metrics are a little more defined. But I'm sure if you're in, maybe in bioscience, choosing those metrics might be much harder. So I would say definitely spend time on that. It is a very important part of gauging whether you're successful at what you're doing or not.
Yeah, and I think universal metrics, it's hard in the sense that it's like, it really depends on the industry. It depends on the business. If you're running a SaaS business, a metric that all SaaS business universally they're tracking, monthly recurring revenue. They're tracking churn rate, and that's universal for all SaaS companies, right? So really you would have to understand what space you're in, what industry, and then, looking at those universal metrics. Does that make sense? I don't know if anybody else wants to add to that.
From a technical perspective, certainly, I will second what was said. It depends on the use case, but typically from a data science perspective, how well your model is predicting the accuracy, the precision, and the whether your model is stable or not would be some of the universal metrics that you can use when you're executing on the ground.
Awesome. And before we close out, are there any final words of wisdom or advice that our speakers would like to share with the audience, or anything that you feel is super relevant to this idea of a cost-effective data strategy that we've talked about so extensively?
Take all the wisdom that we and anybody has with a grain of salt. Be very agile and dynamic in learning. Adapt to situations by learning, listening to experiences, but also being data driven. So this is why the benchmarking study was important for me to customize and change my lens, how I looked at the business from the high level, but also how I build and execute my data science strategy. So experience is very important. So build your own experience and portfolio for people who are listening.
And I think one comment there is that for a lot of company and business, like these are still the early days, and most people are figuring things out indeed. So that's where, like, on one side, yeah, being skeptical is helpful, but on the bright side, being exposed to other things happening beyond your organizations is definitely helpful as well, because they are often large organizations who have also gone through that and publish papers that like basically anticipate a lot of the problem that one would run into. It's still being aware overall that these developments are new for the business world. I mean, relatively new for the business world, and so it's a mix of skepticism, but also being exposed to what's happening in other organizations. Yeah.
I would say be careful about how much data, because there is so much data out there. Be careful about the sources that you are working with, because you could get overwhelmed with this very fast. So definitely spend time on, focus on what your goals are, what it is that you're going to be measuring, etc., because you could get overwhelmed with the amount of data out there sometimes.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a great point. And yeah, I think we've heard a lot of great anecdotes, a lot of great ideas surrounding data strategy and wearing multiple hats. And I definitely have learned a lot, and I think the audience has definitely learned a lot from y'all as well. So thank you so much